Dr. Seuss married 3 times. The second marriage happened so fast, it shocked everyone who knew him. Helen Palmer had co-founded his company, edited his biggest books, and built his empire from nothing. Then, in 1967, she died alone at 69. 10 months later, he married Audrey, the woman who had been visiting their home for years. Helen's contributions were erased. Audrey became Mrs. Seuss, and the real story about what happened in that house stayed hidden until long after he was gone. Dr. Seuss was born Theodore Geisel on March 2, 1904, in Springfield, Massachusetts, and from the beginning his world was already tilted toward imagination. His father managed the Springfield Zoo, and every Sunday he took young Ted behind the cages, where the real world and the strange world he carried in his mind started blending together. While other kids sketched animals the way they looked, Ted added horns where they did not belong and tails that curled like question marks. His mother loved poetry and whispered rhymes to him at night, so rhythm settled into his brain before he even understood what rhythm meant. He went to kindergarten at 4½, and his drawings already looked like they belonged to a different universe. And his mother let him draw on walls like it was training instead of mischief, which built the trademarks that would echo through his books later in life. By the time he reached Central High School between 1917 and 1921, his voice had already found its shape. At 14, on February 7, 1919, he printed his first piece in the school paper. It was called O Latin, and it poked fun at the class everyone dreaded. He played with rhythm and humor without thinking about it. That day he realized words could twist things. He began signing his work under odd names like A Pupil's Nightmare or T.S. Lesieg, his last name spelled backward. His classmates noticed and voted him class wit. His first printed illustration appeared on January 21, 1920, and it made him feel like he could live a whole life through drawings and jokes. That feeling carried him forward. When he arrived at Dartmouth College, he stepped into a bigger world and wanted to belong to it fully. So he joined the humor magazine Jack O'Lantern and became editor. But in 1925, during Prohibition, a late night in his dorm with friends and a bottle of gin cost him everything. The dean banned him from the magazine and any extracurricular activity. It felt like exile. Instead of quitting, he found a loophole. He started submitting work under fake names. Seuss was the one that stuck, a twist on his middle name, and it appeared so often that issue after issue looked like it was being overtaken by ghosts. It became the name that saved him by hiding him. People even voted him least likely to succeed. It should have crushed him, but instead, it made him sharper. It planted the rebellious streak that later powered his political cartoons and his attack on authority. Around the same time, Helen Palmer's path was forming miles away from Ted, but hers mattered just as much. She was born September 16, 1898, in New York City. She graduated from Wellesley College with honors in English in 1920. She taught briefly, but her mind wanted something bigger. She left teaching and went to Oxford, where her life collided with his. She noticed him before he noticed himself. While the professor lectured, Ted doodled. Helen leaned over and said he should forget about being a scholar and become an artist. That single sentence pulled him onto the track that would define his future. They built a bond that felt like a partnership instead of a romance, and she began helping him in quiet ways, editing his work, encouraging him when rejection tried to swallow him, and shaping his drafts when they felt too loose. She rarely took credit, but her fingerprints stayed on every page. They married on October 29, 1927, in New York City. There was no honeymoon. Helen sold Ted's cartoons to Life magazine to pay for a trip to Europe. His first published cartoon came out in July 1928, and it made the world feel like it might open a little wider for them. She managed the details and the business side, while he tried to build a path that could hold both of them. Their marriage became a working partnership, where she held the ropes while he climbed. By 1931, Helen was illustrating projects and strengthening his drafts behind the scenes. She helped with Boners, a children's sayings anthology, smoothing the humor that would later make him famous. But around 1935, her health began to slip. Guillain-Barré syndrome weakened her body. She kept working anyway. She helped edit, reviewed drafts, and guided him even while she was sick. She never let her illness define her place in his world. In 1936, she quit every other responsibility to manage his career full-time. She pushed, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, through 27 rejections before Vanguard Press took it in 1937. Only 400 copies printed. It still sold 6,000 in its first year and opened the door they had been banging on. Their lives began stretching forward. Words and pictures finally paid the rent instead of dreams. Mulberry Street launched a climb. Theodore Geisel was 33 when he nearly burned the manuscript, but a friend stopped him. The rhythm in the book came from a ship engine thumping against the hull on his way home, and Helen cut half the manuscript to tighten it. She added touches that made the story memorable, including a parade that lifted the whole thing into something bigger than real life. The book created a template he would use again and again, turning ordinary places into extraordinary ones. Before that breakthrough, he had paid bills by drawing for Judge, Life, and College humor. Then, one cartoon in a salon caught the eye of someone connected to a Flit bug spray executive. The tagline, "Quick Henry the Flit," became a national catchphrase. He earned $25 per cartoon and produced more than 30 Judge covers. The campaign ran until 1943 and helped buy their home in La Jolla. It also pushed him into advertising themes that later reappeared in stories like The Lorax. In 1938, The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins added satire to his voice. It sold 25,000 copies and gave him a $3,000 advance. The next year came The King's Stilts. Helen added emotional weight to the story, slipping metaphors about balance and power into the pages. In 1940, Horton Hatches the Egg became his first big hit, selling 50,000 copies. Readers loved Horton's loyalty. Helen had pushed that book forward even when he doubted it. Then the world changed. As America drifted toward World War II, Seuss turned to political cartoons. From 1941 to 1943, he drew more than 400 of them for the newspaper PM. He attacked isolationists like Charles Lindbergh and mocked politicians who wanted America to stand still while fascism spread. His cartoons were harsh and sometimes cruel. In January 1942, he drew Japanese Americans as traitors during the fear leading up to the mass incarceration that followed. Those drawings became a stain on his legacy. Helen questioned him quietly, but he kept drawing for impact. Later, he joined the Army Signal Corps, wrote training films, and reached the rank of captain. Helen co-wrote Design for Death, which later won an Oscar. The war made both of them older on the inside. After the war, her health declined again. She edited through pain and paralysis. She pushed his work when she could barely sit up. The world saw his name on the covers, but her hands shaped every line. She struggled with illness for years until she died by suicide in 1967. She had held his world up for decades, and the weight eventually crushed her. In 1954, Life magazine reported that American children could not read. A challenge was made. Write a book using only 225 simple words. That challenge became The Cat in the Hat in 1957. 1 million copies sold in its first year. It transformed children's literature. Beginner books formed around that success, and Helen stepped in again. She rejected mountains of manuscripts and built a system that demanded quality. She helped bring in The Grinch in 1957, which sold 250,000 copies in its first year. By 1965, beginner books hit $10 million in revenue, and she owned nearly half. In 1960 came Green Eggs and Ham, only 50 different words. It started as a bet for $50. By 1965, it earned more than $1 million in royalties. It kept selling, passing 8 million copies by 2007. She was battling cancer when it exploded in popularity. Even in pain, she pushed the idea of trying new things. That insistence carried the book into history. Hop on Pop came out in 1963, and on the surface, it looked like a simple, funny book for tiny kids who were just learning their first words. It went on to sell more than 1.5 million copies in its first year, turning into a beginner books bestseller and a classroom favorite. The words were short. The sentences were easy. That was the whole point. Behind those easy pages, though, was a system Helen Palmer had helped build piece by piece. She was Dr. Seuss's wife in public, often just Mrs. Geisel, but in the work she was much more than that. From her wheelchair, while she was already very sick, she quietly co-authored or edited at least 10 beginner books titles, including Hop on Pop. She pushed a method that blended phonics and sight words so children could learn to read with rhythm and repetition. That approach became the model a lot of schools copied for years, yet her name mostly stayed off the covers. The world saw the cat and the rhymes. Helen saw lesson plans and reading levels, and still, the praise landed almost entirely on Ted. 2 years later, in January 1965, Fox in Socks arrived and turned Storytime into a test. Parents and teachers tripped over its tongue twisters, kids begged to hear it again, and the book quickly became famous for how hard it was to read aloud. The playful chaos on the page had a very personal source. Helen was struggling with speech because of her illness, and she went through difficult speech therapy sessions. Ted began playing with impossible strings of words as a way to push her, tease her, and help her at the same time. In his private letters, he admitted that she made him better, and that her challenges shaped the way he wrote. He even tested the worst tongue twisters on his editor, Bennett Cerf, slipping in lines that were almost impossible to deliver cleanly, and waiting to see if anyone could make it through. The world saw a silly Fox in Socks. Inside the house, it was also a kind of therapy session turned into a book, with Helen's struggle stamped into every stumble and every laugh, while her name stayed mostly in the background. By then, their La Jolla estate had already become the center of their world. Ted and Helen bought the property in 1944 and kept expanding it through the 1960s until it turned into a wide, quiet place that looked perfect from the outside. Artists, friends, and neighbors visited, and among them was an equestrienne and nurse named Audrey Stone Diamond. She spent more and more time on the property. In 1963, Helen wrote in her diary about a spark she noticed between Audrey and Ted. It started as a small note, a passing line, but it opened a page that would never really close again. Through the mid-1960s, Audrey's visits became frequent enough that people around them began to talk. The same estate that held drawings, manuscripts, and celebrations also held glances, rumors, and one growing secret. After Helen died in 1967, Ted married Audrey less than a year later. For many of their friends, the house no longer felt like a simple creative sanctuary. It felt like the stage where a long private drama had played out. In 1961, in the middle of all of this, the Sneetches appeared with its strange birds and star bellies and its blunt lesson about prejudice. On the surface, it was a funny story about discrimination and how easily people can be fooled. Behind it stood Helen again, pushing Ted to deal with post-war bigotry, and hatred. She wanted a book that spoke clearly about discrimination and equality, and the story they shaped together sold more than 100,000 copies in its first year. Teachers used it to talk about tolerance and civil rights. But while the book was helping children think about inclusion, Helen's own private notes were sinking into something much darker. In her writings, she described her life as a spiral going down, and she wrote about her health, her pain, and the strain on her marriage. She saw the Sneetches as a kind of last push to do something that mattered while she still could. The message in the book came from her ideals, but the tone in her journal came from exhaustion and regret, and those two currents were running side by side. By 1967, the numbers around Dr. Seuss told a story of triumph. More than 60 million books sold worldwide. His characters were in homes, schools, and libraries across the world. That same year, Helen was bedridden with cancer, still working. She edited the iBook from her hospital bed, forcing herself through one last project. Every change she made took effort, and yet she kept doing it because that was the partnership she had built with Ted from the beginning. She finished those final edits, and not long after, in October 1967, she died. For readers, 1967 looked like a peak year for Dr. Seuss. For Helen, it was the end, and her last book edit became a quiet farewell. Ted's later marriage to Audrey shook their circle of friends, but Helen's work stayed on the shelves without her name rising to meet it. To understand how heavy that end really was, you have to go back to who Audrey was and how she entered their lives. Audrey Stone Diamond, born in 1927, was a married mother of two living in La Jolla during the 1950s. She had posed nude for the La Jolla Light newspaper, which was bold in that era, and she moved in social circles that overlapped with the Geisels. In 1963, Ted sketched her at her window, and their connection grew from there. By 1965, when Ted was 61, their affair had fully begun. At that same time, Helen was hospitalized with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder, and already burdened by other illnesses. Audrey was 38, and she divorced her husband while she was visiting Ted almost every day. Inside the Geisel home, what might have looked like friendship turned into the main emotional storm. People close to the family later described Audrey as the homewrecker next door, and the scandal shook La Jolla gossip circles even before the public knew anything. In 1966, Helen discovered the truth herself. Already weak and in pain, she found love letters between Ted and Audrey in his studio. The letters carried lines such as, "You're my escape," which cut straight through whatever hope she had been holding. She confronted Ted in October 1966 and begged him to choose her and their marriage. Her niece, Peggy Owens, later described how devastating that period was. Helen's health, already fragile, began to fall even faster after that discovery. Audrey was not an unknown woman from far away. She was a neighbor and a friend, and that made the betrayal feel closer and sharper. In October 1967, Helen died by suicide. Her suicide note tied her death directly to despair, illness, and the wish to protect Ted. The people who knew her understood that the affair and the emotional collapse around it were central to what happened. The fallout touched Audrey's own children, too. After the affair became public and Helen's suicide shook their world, Audrey sent her two daughters, then about 9 and 14, to boarding school in 1967. People who knew the family described Audrey as guilt-ridden, staring toward the Geisel oceanfront home as if she could not look away from what had happened. Some acquaintances saw the decision to send the girls away as an attempt to give them a quieter environment. Others saw it as a kind of escape, as if Audrey were stepping into a new life with Ted while pushing her children to the side. The daughters, Lee Gray and Lark Gray, were said to be unhappy and hurt by the separation. Years later, Audrey admitted that she wished she had been a better mother, but by then, the scars were already written into their lives. Ted's way of dealing with the crisis followed a different path. After Helen discovered the affair, he pulled back from direct confrontation and talked in careful lines. By July 1968, he was telling friends that marriage to Audrey was an inescapable conclusion. Helen's suicide the previous October shocked many people, but his practical tone afterward and his quick marriage to Audrey deepened the anger and hurt. He married Audrey within a year of Helen's death, and many saw that timing as a confirmation of all the rumors. Helen's physical and emotional suffering had been severe before she died, and her note showed that she still loved Ted, even as she felt herself falling apart. Some family members and writers later described her suicide as her last and greatest gift to him, because it tried to protect his reputation, even in her final words. Those years, from 1966 to 1968, marked one of the darkest stretches in the Geisel story. The suicide note itself became the center of that darkness. On October 23, 1967, Helen died by suicide in their La Jolla home at 69. In the note she left for Ted, she wrote, "Dear Ted, what has happened to us? I don't know. I feel myself in a spiral, going down, 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 into a black hole from which there is no escape, no brightness, and loud in my ears from every side I hear, failure, failure, failure." She went on, "My going will leave quite a rumor, but you can say I was overworked and overwrought. Your reputation with your friends and fans will not be harmed." Their maid found the note at 8 in the morning, along with a prescription bottle that once held 1,000 capsules, but now held only 706. The coroner listed cancer and Guillain-Barré syndrome as part of the medical explanation, but the note itself was something else entirely. It was a script. Ted used that script to explain her death to publishers and the public. She gave him a story that protected his image, and he leaned on it. The full truth about the affair stayed hidden for years. That choice touched everything that followed. Helen had helped found Beginner Books and had edited more than 20 titles, yet after her death, there was no public funeral for her. Her ashes were scattered in private. Company histories moved forward, with little mention of her co-founding role. As the Seuss brand grew, official stories focused on Ted's genius, his grief, and his need to continue working. Helen's decades of edits, negotiations, and sacrifices were treated as background details or skipped entirely. The way her remains were handled matched the way her history was handled. Quietly, privately, and mostly out of sight. In a letter to his niece, Peggy Dahmen Owens, Ted finally dropped the public mask and spoke plainly about at least one hidden part of their life. He wrote that it was not true that they did not want children. The real reason was his infertility after a bout of mumps in the 1920s. He explained that the illness had left him sterile. Helen, for her part, had undergone surgery in 1930 at age 33 for undiagnosed abdominal pain, and doctors removed her ovaries, which meant she could not carry a child. Together, that meant they had no path to biological children. Outside the family, people thought they had chosen a child-free life. Inside, there was loss and medical history that almost no one knew. Peggy, who had lost her own mother at 17 and been taken in by the Geisels, was one of the very few who heard the real story. That letter showed a rare moment of guilt and regret from Ted, a moment that did not appear in his public interviews. The way he handled his second marriage followed the same pattern of careful control. On August 5, 1968, just months after Helen's suicide, 64-year-old Ted married 41-year-old Audrey Stone Demond in a Reno courthouse. There were no friends, no family, no big ceremony. In letters, he told his circle that he had not flipped his lid, and that marrying someone 18 years younger felt inevitable to him. They cleared California's 6-week waiting period after divorce, and then the quick wedding happened quietly. There was no press announcement. The two of them returned to La Jolla, where the ghosts of the previous years still hung over the house. Friends and fans were stunned, especially since rumors about the affair had already been drifting through their community. After that, changes in the business side followed. Helen had owned 49% of Beginner Books. Once Audrey was in the picture as his new wife, Ted shifted that stake to her. Officially, Audrey became Mrs. Seuss and stepped into the role of managing and guarding his literary legacy. Over time, biographies, marketing materials, and public statements began to emphasize Audrey's role and minimize Helen's. The woman who had built Beginner Books with Ted and shaped early reading for millions of children became a faint name in the background. The woman who arrived later became the gatekeeper of the brand. In public, Ted often turned his private life into jokes that hid the heavier truth. When people asked why he never had children, he would quip, "You have 'em? I'll entertain 'em." He never mentioned his sterility from mumps or Helen's surgery in 1930. The affair with Audrey and its effect on Helen stayed buried. Obituaries at the time of Helen's death claimed she died in her sleep or gave vague wording. Her suicide note, with its clear concern about his image and its repeated word failure, did not appear in those public stories. Only later did the details come out, showing how far the narrative had been bent. Decades later, Audrey herself spoke about Helen and the past. In a 2000 interview with the New York Times, she said, "Helen did out of necessity. Better person than me," admitting that Helen had sacrificed herself to keep Ted's world steady. Audrey also said she was not entirely like Helen, recognizing that she did not carry the same kind of quiet strength. After marrying Ted, she had sent her daughters away to school, just as Helen had once had complicated relationships with her own stepchildren. That parallel deepened the sense of distance inside both families. Audrey's honesty about her shortcomings and Helen's nobility pulled the curtain back a little on the guilt, grief, and rivalry sitting behind the cartoon animals. For a long time, most readers had no idea any of this had happened. Biographies of Dr. Seuss that came out in the 1970s and 1980s often brushed past Helen's suicide and completely skipped the affair. In the 1980s, Ted burned his affair letters, making sure that his private correspondence with Audrey would never end up in an archive. That act of destruction kept the Seuss image bright and simple for fans. Only later, especially with the 1995 biography by Brian J. Jones and further reporting, did more complete stories begin to surface. The wholesome myth of Dr. Seuss had decades to grow without serious challenge, while the messier reality stayed hidden in diaries, private letters, and the memories of a few relatives. Even his work for children carried shadows that would only be fully called out much later. On March 2, 2021, which was Dr. Seuss's birthday, Dr. Seuss Enterprises announced that it would no longer publish 6 of his books because of racist and insensitive drawings. One of the most criticized titles was If I Ran the Zoo from 1950, which showed Asian figures with exaggerated slanted eyes and placed them as carriers holding a white man on their heads while holding guns. Other books pulled were And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, McElligot's Pool, On Beyond Zebra, Scrambled Eggs Super, and The Cat's Quizzer. In many of these, African characters were drawn as primitive, and Asian characters were framed as exotic or servile. Teachers and activists had warned for years that the images were harmful. When the decision finally came, those books suddenly became collector items, with first editions selling for thousands of dollars. Sales of Seuss titles in general actually jumped, topping 1.2 million copies in the weeks following the announcement. The debate moved into the larger public square, where people argued over legacy, censorship, and how to judge beloved artists whose work carried both joy and damage.